Amy Lopez was 24 years old, a college student from Texas, traveling through Europe when she decided to spend one more day exploring Koblenz, Germany. On September 26, 1994, at 8:50 in the morning, Amy was seen alive for the last time as she headed toward Ehrenbreitstein Fortress. Less than 2 hours later, two children discovered her body inside a secluded room. She had been sexually assaulted, restrained, stabbed multiple times, and strangled. For nearly 32 years, the person responsible remained unidentified. Then investigators returned to evidence that had been preserved since 1994, and DNA recovered from Amy's clothing pointed them toward an 81-year-old man. But there was an extraordinary twist. This wasn't the first time the man had entered the German criminal justice system. And when his murder trial finally began in August 2026, he admitted that he had killed Amy Lopez. This is the story of a murder that remained unanswered for nearly 3 decades, and the DNA evidence that finally changed everything. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This video covers a real murder case and includes references to sexual assault, violence, and disturbing evidence. Viewer discretion is advised. If you enjoy stories about cold cases finally being solved, subscribe to Unresolved Case and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to September 1994. Amy Lopez was 24 years old and from Texas. She was a college student who had traveled to Europe in September 1994 as part of a 6-week tour. For most of the trip, Amy was with a tour group, but by the time the group moved on, she decided to stay in Koblenz for a little longer. That decision meant she was on her own. Koblenz sits where the Rhine and Moselle rivers meet, and above the city is Ehrenbreitstein Fortress, a massive historic complex overlooking the river. It was the kind of place a visitor could spend hours exploring, and that's where Amy planned to go that morning. There was nothing unusual about her plans. She was simply a young American tourist, taking advantage of one more day in Germany before continuing her journey. On September 26th, Amy left for the fortress. At around 8:50 in the morning, she was seen alive for the last time. What happened during the next hour is still difficult to reconstruct completely, but investigators know that Amy entered the fortress grounds and eventually ended up inside a secluded room known as the General von Aster Zimmer, or General von Aster Chamber. She never walked back out. By around 10 o'clock, two children who were playing near the fortress discovered Amy's body inside that room. The case immediately became a murder investigation, and for Amy's family, that morning in Germany would become the moment their lives changed forever. But there was something investigators had recovered from the crime scene that would become far more important decades later. They just didn't know it yet, because the evidence that eventually helped identify the man accused of killing Amy wasn't discovered in 2026. It had been collected back in 1994. At 8:50 a.m., Amy was seen alive near Ehrenbreitstein Fortress. That would become the last confirmed sighting of her. The fortress was a busy historic site, but parts of it were much quieter than the areas tourists normally visited. Somewhere inside that complex was the General von Aster Zimmer, a secluded room that would soon become the center of a murder investigation. What happened after Amy entered that part of the fortress is pieced together mainly from the evidence investigators found afterward. Amy was sexually assaulted and restrained with handcuffs. She suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and injuries consistent with strangulation. Investigators also determined that a stone had been used against her. Her jeans had been turned inside out during the attack, and that detail would become extremely important, but not for many years. By roughly 10 a.m., two children playing near the fortress discovered Amy's body inside the room. The discovery transformed what had been an ordinary morning at a historic landmark into a crime scene. Police began working backward. Who had seen Amy that morning? Who had been inside the fortress? How did she end up in that secluded room? And most importantly, who had done this? Investigators collected evidence and began searching for answers. But there was one problem they couldn't overcome. they had no clear name to attach to the biological evidence recovered from the scene. In 1994, DNA testing could help investigators compare biological evidence to a known person. But if the person responsible wasn't already in a database, or investigators didn't have a reason to test him, the evidence could sit there without producing an identity. And that's essentially what happened. The physical evidence remained. Amy's case remained open, but the name behind that evidence remained unknown. And this is where Amy's case became a cold case. The evidence hadn't disappeared, it was still there. What investigators didn't have was a way to connect that evidence to a person. That would change years later, after another case brought an important name into the picture. The investigation continued after Amy's body was found. Police interviewed people, examined the crime scene, and worked to reconstruct what had happened inside the fortress. Evidence was preserved, including biological material that could potentially identify the person responsible. But there was no immediate match. And as the years passed, the case became harder to solve. The problem wasn't necessarily that investigators had nothing, they had evidence. What they didn't have was a name. Then, in 1999, 5 years after Amy's murder, a man named Hans S. came to the attention of authorities in Koblenz for a completely different crime. He was convicted of attempting to rape a 16-year-old girl and sentenced to 7 years in prison. As part of that case, authorities obtained his DNA. That detail would eventually become extremely important to the Amy Lopez investigation. But there was a problem. The DNA profile connected to Hans S. was not simply available to investigators decades later. Under Germany's rules governing the retention of forensic data, the earlier profile was eventually deleted. So even though Hans S. had entered the criminal justice system in the years after Amy's murder, investigators couldn't simply go back to a database in 2026 and pull up his old DNA profile. The connection to Amy still wasn't there. For years, Amy's murder remained unsolved. Then advances in forensic technology gave investigators a reason to look at the old evidence again. And this time, they weren't just asking whether the evidence could be tested. They were asking a much more specific question. Could modern technology recover something from Amy's clothing that investigators in 1994 couldn't identify? The answer would eventually lead investigators back to a man they had already encountered years earlier. But they still needed one thing before they could make the connection. They needed a fresh DNA sample. The investigation was now looking at evidence that had been sitting in police custody for decades. Technology had changed dramatically since 1994. Modern forensic methods could sometimes recover usable DNA from extremely small traces of biological material, traces that might not have produced a useful result when the case was first investigated. So investigators went back through Amy's evidence. Around 1,600 samples were examined as part of the renewed investigation. And one piece of evidence stood out: Amy's jeans. The jeans had been turned inside out during the attack. Investigators were able to identify a DNA trace from the inside of the waistband. That location mattered. It wasn't simply a random piece of evidence recovered somewhere near the fortress. The biological material was on Amy's clothing, in a place investigators could examine using modern forensic techniques. The next challenge was identifying whose DNA it was. And this is where the investigation became more complicated. Hans S.'s earlier DNA profile from his 1999 conviction was no longer available in the way investigators needed. So investigators couldn't simply compare the old crime scene DNA against the profile from decades earlier. Instead, they obtained a new saliva sample from Hans S. That sample was compared with the DNA recovered from Amy's clothing, and the result changed the case. The DNA matched. Investigators now had a direct forensic connection between Hans S. and evidence recovered from Amy Lopez. After almost 32 years, the investigation finally had a name. But there was another remarkable detail. The man investigators were now looking at wasn't someone who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He was 81 years old. In 1994, when Amy was killed, he had been 49. Now, more than 3 decades later, investigators had to confront the possibility that the answer to one of Koblenz's oldest murder cases had been much closer to the investigation's history than anyone realized. For years, the DNA had been there. The technology had changed. And when investigators finally got a fresh sample from Hans S., the evidence pointed back to him. But finding the DNA match was only the beginning. In February 2026, police would go looking for the 81-year-old man whose DNA had finally connected him to Amy's case. On February 23, 2026, almost 32 years after Amy Lopez was murdered, German investigators arrested Hans S. He was 81 years old. The arrest brought the investigation into the present day in a way nobody could have expected back in 1994. The case had survived 3 decades, and now investigators had both a DNA connection and a suspect. But there was something else that made Hans S.'s history particularly significant. He had already been convicted of a sexual offense in Koblenz years after Amy's murder. That conviction had put his DNA into the hands of investigators. But by the time Amy's case was being revisited decades later, that old DNA profile was no longer available because of Germany's data retention rules. So the breakthrough depended on something much more basic. Investigators needed to obtain a new sample. They did. And that new sample provided the comparison they had been missing. Now Hans S. was facing charges connected to a murder that had remained unsolved since 1994. The prosecution's case alleged that Amy had been attacked inside the secluded room at Ehrenbreitstein Fortress, and that the killing was committed in connection with a sexual assault. For investigators, the arrest answered one question that had remained open for almost 3 decades. Who could be connected to the DNA left on Amy's clothing? But there was still one question nobody could answer yet. What would Hans S. say when he finally had to face the case in court? By August, that moment had arrived. Nearly 32 years after Amy Lopez walked into Ehrenbreitstein Fortress, the man accused of killing her was sitting inside a courtroom in Koblenz. And on the very first day of his trial, he finally spoke about what happened. On August 18, 2026, almost 32 years after Amy Lopez was murdered, the case finally reached a courtroom in Koblenz. Hans S. was now 81 years old. He appeared in court using a walker, facing charges connected to a crime that had happened when he was 49. Across the courtroom was the story that had followed investigators for more than 3 decades. Amy had arrived in Germany as a 24-year-old American college student. She had gone to Ehrenbreitstein Fortress on the morning of September 26, 1994. At 8:50 a.m., she was seen alive. By around 10 o'clock, she was dead. And for almost 32 years, nobody had been able to say with certainty who was responsible. Now the prosecution was accusing Hans S. of sexually assaulting and murdering her inside the General von Aster Chamber. The evidence against him included the DNA connection investigators had developed from Amy's clothing. But there was something the DNA could never provide on its own. It couldn't explain what happened inside that room. It couldn't tell the court what Hans S. was thinking that morning. And it couldn't answer every question that had remained unanswered since 1994. For that, investigators had to hear from the man himself. Then, at the beginning of the trial, Hans S. admitted that he had killed Amy Lopez. After all those years, the man accused of her murder was finally acknowledging responsibility for her death. He also admitted to sexually assaulting her. For investigators, it was an extraordinary moment. The case that had begun in 1994, with a body discovered inside a secluded room at a German fortress, had now reached a courtroom, and the accused was no longer simply a name attached to a DNA match. He was sitting there, answering questions about the crime. But his admission did not suddenly explain everything. According to reports from the proceedings, Hans S. said he had gaps in his memory concerning parts of the attack. That meant some details surrounding Amy's final moments remained disputed or unclear, even after his admission. And that's important because this wasn't the end of the legal process. The trial was still underway. A confession is a major piece of evidence, but it does not replace the court's responsibility to examine the evidence and reach a judgment. Still, something had changed that morning in Koblenz. For the first time, the investigation had connected the evidence from 1994 to a living suspect, and that suspect had acknowledged killing Amy. Think about the timeline. In 1994, Amy was murdered. In 1999, Hans S. was convicted in a separate sexual offense case and provided DNA. Years later, that earlier DNA profile was no longer available because of data retention rules. Then investigators returned to Amy's case. They examined old evidence with modern forensic methods. They found a DNA trace on her clothing. They obtained a fresh sample from Hans S., and the DNA matched. Then, in February 2026, police arrested him, and 6 months later, in August, he stood before a court and admitted that he had killed Amy Lopez. Almost 32 years had passed between the morning Amy walked toward that fortress and the moment the man accused of killing her finally acknowledged what he had done. For Amy's family, the case had finally reached a point that seemed impossible for so many years. There was a name, there was forensic evidence, there was an arrest, and now there was an admission. But the courtroom still had one final job to do: determine what the evidence, the confession, and the prosecution's case ultimately meant under German law. And that part of Amy Lopez's story was still unfolding. For decades, Amy Lopez's murder was one of those cases without an ending. The investigation had evidence, but no answer. Then forensic technology changed what investigators could do with that evidence. A trace recovered from Amy's clothing became part of a new investigation. A fresh DNA sample provided the comparison investigators needed. And nearly 32 years after the murder, police arrested an 81-year-old man. Amy's story is also a reminder of why evidence from cold cases matters. A piece of clothing, a biological trace, a sample preserved decades earlier, something that may not have been enough to solve a case in 1994 can become much more valuable as forensic science advances. Amy went to Germany as a 24-year-old college student traveling through Europe. She never made it home. But after nearly 3 decades, the question of who investigators believed was responsible finally had an answer. The evidence had been there all along. It just took 32 years for investigators to finally read it. If you want to see more cases where old evidence leads to new answers, subscribe to Unresolved Case.